Hi, I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. You can see from the scene behind me that I am in New York City. Not far from me is the legendary Madison Square Garden, home of many heavyweight bouts in the past. And we're here in New York to witness another heavyweight bout. The New York dollar versus the rest of the world, or I should say the American dollar. And so far, it looks like the dollar in round 15 of its post-World War II epic bout with the rest of the world is about to go down. Stacy Herbert down in the newsroom. Talk to me.
Hello, Max. Yes, the dollar is in the news. In fact, it's in my very first headline here. IMF's Lagarde says U.S. dollar may lose privilege amid debt limit crisis. So this is the new International Monetary Fund Managing Director, Christine Lagarde. Let's just cut to the clip here where she's interviewed on PBS NewsHour.
The global economy is clearly highly dependent on the U.S. economy because the U.S. economy is the first in the world, and it's a major power in many respects. So to have the lead economy uncertain about its debt ceiling is quite worrisome. And if you were to take it further, clearly there would be consequences in the rest of the world, not just in the United States. For example, the dollar has always enjoyed what Giscard d'Estaing, the former French president many years ago, called the exorbitant privilege of the dollar, because it was the currency, the reserve currency that most central banks had. Well, clearly, if there was a dent in this exorbitant privilege and the confidence that most people have towards the dollar, it would probably entail a decline of the dollar relative to other currencies, and probably doubts in the mind of those people who reserve currencies as to whether the dollar is effectively the ultimate and prime currency of reserve.
Yeah, Stacy, exorbitant privilege, which is a nice way to say rent-seeking by the U.S. dollar being the world's reserve currency. The United States gets an extraordinary play on the global economy. And this has insulated Americans from price hikes in food and energy in a way that 99.9% of Americans don't understand, but they will understand soon. Because even though the U.S. is experiencing a recession, a slowdown, they haven't seen nothing yet. Because once the dollar truly collapses, price of gas will quadruple, price of food will skyrocket, and then we're really going to see what the American economy is all about. A third world pig dressed up with a lot of lipstick and phony accounting tricks.
Well, Max, but in a way, I think it's kind of like the oil curse, the having this exorbitant privilege of the U.S. dollar, in that the government really doesn't need the population because they can just print money. They truly can, unlike any European country, where in Europe you have to work for a living. You actually have to produce wealth in order to maintain your standard of living or to increase your wealth. You have to actually produce it. In America, they can just print it, and therefore the population itself is not needed.
Yeah, let me emphasize the point that you're making, because it's a point you've made before, and it's an excellent point. In the oil-rich countries, they do not need their population, so they abandon them, and you see that huge wealth and income gap. In America, because of this exorbitant privilege, American policymakers do not need their population. They don't need a middle class. They just print money for Wall Street. Wall Street speculates. When they make a mistake, they go to Washington, they print more money, and of course Washington imposes austerity measures which have been invisible to most Americans because of this world reserve currency status the U.S. dollar enjoys, which it is about to lose. The rating on U.S. Treasury bonds is on the way down, from AAA down to BBB, down to wherever Greece's debt rating is at the current moment. And this whole bond Ponzi scheme that's been enforced for decades is crumbling. And Christine Lagarde is absolutely correct. Of course, she took over from Dominic Strauss-Kahn, who's got some troubles here in New York City. Maybe we'll get an interview with him later.
But let's go back to this exorbitant privilege, because this is what Valerie Desteng said, as she referred to. But this was under the Charles de Gaulle administration, recall. And this is the first time that America really went bankrupt big time on the global stage, because in 1969, Charles de Gaulle asked for the $300 million worth of gold that the U.S. technically owed France due to the trade deficit. And France sent a naval ship over here to New York to collect their gold. And America had to give it to France, had to give the $300 million worth of gold. Shortly thereafter, Britain asked for their gold as well, which was similarly about $300 million. America went bankrupt, basically. They said, no, we closed the gold window. We're not going to pay you what we owe you. So this whole debt ceiling debacle has already happened before spectacularly America did go bust. But Charles de Gaulle had warned that, you know, it was the post-Bretton Woods, the Bretton Woods era, when they established the U.S. dollar as a reserve currency. He complained that it would be an exorbitant privilege and that America would run deficits to the eye could see because they wouldn't really have to pay for anything.
That's right. And why was Nixon forced to close the gold window at that time, 1971, to pay for the Vietnam War? And why is America bankrupt today? To pay for wars of convenience, war profiteering in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the whole fake wars that the U.S. is engaged with using real American dollars. It's interesting because the New York Fed, which is, of course, where France's gold was kept, is also where a lot of European gold is kept, including Germany. 60% of Germany's gold is held in the New York Fed in New York. Do you think Germany will send a warship down to New York Harbor and demand its gold back, Stacy?
Max, Germany has zero chance of getting back their gold. As Jim Rickards says, I think it's, you could safely include it in the U.S. reserves, whatever those might be.
Yeah, well, another country that is experiencing the heebie-jeebies, a little bit nervousness here, is China. Tell us what's on China's mind.
Roach says Chinese officials appalled by impasse on raising debt ceiling. So this is something that you and I have talked about, is the banana republicanization of America. That's the thing that is concerning China. It's not that the debt ceiling was always going to be raised. That's never really going to be an issue, because at the end of the day it has to be raised because it's just paying for what Congress has already ordered. This is spending that Congress has already spent. They're the ones that ordered the administration to spend this money, and that was the debt ceiling. But they're concerned about, according to Stephen Roach, who's the non-executive chairman of Morgan Stanley Asia, he cited an unnamed Chinese policymaker as saying in mid-July that we understand politics, but your government's continued recklessness is astonishing.
Well, yeah, absolutely. What we have in the Washington, D.C. is a repudiation of the 2008 election. There are a lot of folks in Washington that would like to annul Barack Obama's election as president, and they're doing so by forcing this debt ceiling issue as a referendum on his presidency. This is an impeachment, a virtual impeachment, and they're going to basically put a gun to the economy's head the same way that Hank Paulson put a gun to Congress's head back in 2008 and extracted and extorted $750 billion for his banking buddies. Now Boehner and his group of politicians, his friends in Washington, are putting a gun to Obama's head and say, either you abandon your presidency, you give us all the power, or we're taking this economy down. It's what we've been calling on this show financial terrorism. It's the most pernicious and ugliest form of terrorism in the world. It makes Al-Qaeda look like Mother Teresa in terms of scope, damage, and the destruction to human life. And Boehner is kind of like a terrorist with a suntan. He's the suntan terrorist, financial terrorist from Washington.
But it's also part of the banana republicanization, and we've talked about this a number of times, is this often happens like in the Egyptian economy. How Egypt fell apart, how Mubarak left office, is because there were turf wars between the various monopolies over the sectors of the economy. So when you have these very powerful oligarchies, this is always what happens in the end of a banana republican economy, is, you know, their powerful interests for each party. They take the red team or blue team.
Yes, it's a winner-take-all mentality fed by the corrupt ideology of that communist strumpet Ayn Rand, who's enjoying some popularity again in America, and her philosophy of take everything, kill everybody, and don't have a conscience about it.
Let's move on to the next headline, Max. While the Boehner and Obama are fiddling while Rome burns, literally, let's look at how Rome is burning. Recession took bigger bite than estimated. So the 2007 to 2009 recession gouged the world's largest economy more deeply than previously estimated. Gross domestic product shrank 5.1% from the fourth quarter of 2007 to the second quarter of 2009, compared with the previously reported 4.1% drop. Now, this is from the Commerce Department, but the most important thing that they say here is that companies fared better and workers worse over the past 3 years than previously thought. Before tax corporate profits adjusted for the value of inventories and capital depreciation were revised up by $264.9 billion over the period, led by improved earnings at financial institutions, Max. So from 2007 to 2009, the Commerce Department is saying that the corporate profits at banks actually went up.
Yes, well, corporations rely more and more on their dealings with Wall Street and their dealings in derivatives, which are extraordinarily profitable. And when you get the government to give these corporations trillions, now we know that they gave away $13 trillion to American banks and foreign banks. It's not hard to make money. Even a rhesus monkey could make $1 billion if you give them $1 billion in free coupons. And if they make a mistake, you give them another $1 billion. It's surprising they didn't make more money. Meanwhile, the jobless rate has continued to go higher. The wages have continued to deteriorate. Anyone who's actually working for a living would never say that there's been anything like a recovery from the crash of 2008. And now they're saying, yeah, you know what? There really was a worse crash than we were saying. And by the way, going forward, it's going to be worse than we can ever imagine. So again, it's up to the people when the social contract is broken to revolt.
You know, I think people would be surprised at these statistics that came out from the Commerce Department. They were released, of course, during the kabuki theater of the debt ceiling kabuki. So most people didn't see this. But the fact is that every American will know that the crisis is a banking crisis. So you would think during a banking crisis that their profits would go down. But in fact, they went up, and they performed better during this crisis than any American who is now being asked to pay for this, but also being asked to pay through the exorbitant privilege that they're about to lose, and they just have no idea what is going to happen once they lose the exorbitant privilege of the U.S. dollar as a reserve currency.
Yeah, and once again, Barack Obama, when he came into office, because he didn't throw Geithner out, Larry Summers, Ben Bernanke, he's paying the price for allowing the financial terrorists to run his campaign and run this country. Now he's being marginalized. The IMF is running the show. Barack Obama has become a non-entity. All right, Stacy Herbert from the newsroom. Thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
Don't go away. Much more coming your way. Stay right there.
The people of the United States and their friends and allies will not live at the mercy of an outlaw regime that threatens the peace with weapons of mass murder.
His regime has an active program to acquire and develop nuclear weapons, and let there be no doubt about it.
We know for a fact that there are weapons there.
This work is being carried out under the direction of Dr. David Kay, a respected scientist and former UN inspector who is leading the weapons search in Iraq.
We are determined to take this apart. We have a tremendous group of dedicated American men and women involved in this with the best assets of the intelligence community can provide.
David Kay is not going to be done with this for quite some time.
David Kay wants more time.
And he says it could take another 6 to 9 months to make a definitive finding.
Administration is asking Congress for hundreds of millions more.
$600 million to fund the continuing search.
We have not yet found shiny, pointy things that I would call a weapon.
Before we can draw firm conclusions, we need to let the Iraq Survey Group complete its work.
We were all wrong, probably, in my judgment. And that is most disturbing.
Sometimes the true patriot takes the unpopular course, but helps their country avoid mistakes. And even if they can't persuade, at least they tried.
Patriotism is the last refuge of scoundrels.
And I think these are scoundrels. They have no argument now. They have no defense for what they did. The country is in a terrible international security situation that I think is perilous. So they're attacking the patriotism of others.
Hungry for the full story? We've got it firsthand. The biggest issues get a human voice, face to face with the newsmakers on RT.
Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Here I am on the glorious west side of Manhattan, here to witness firsthand the collapse of the American dollar, the American empire, the American belief system, the American dream. It's all crashing in real time right here on the west side of Manhattan. Let's go down to the newsroom and check in once again with Stacy Herbert. Hello, Stacy.
Hey, Max. Actually, you were due to speak to a guest in Shanghai, and you were going to talk about the redback, but perhaps China is not ready to take over the world because apparently their internet system actually isn't up to steam.
Well, that's an interesting point about Stacy, about China's rise to power, is that they have done so on the back of illusory projects known as ghost cities. So the government has engaged in shovel-ready projects, as Barack Obama might call them, building skyscrapers in villages and towns and cities that nobody lives in these cities. But it looks like they're generating GDP growth. Meanwhile, they're beholden to America through the relationship with the U.S. dollar, and now the U.S. dollar is crashing. This is setting the stage for a global conflict. I heard somebody make the following comment, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts about it. They said that the posturing going on in Washington reminds them of what happened before World War I. Countries were intransient, they're taking their positions, they're digging their heels in, and then suddenly it popped off. It seems to me that this is what's happening right now, Stacy. Countries and politicians are taking these positions where they're not willing to back down, seeing how this thing is going to blow up at first. And this is leading to potentially a global conflict in the financial war that would be really a defining moment for the 21st century.
Well, at the time of the pre-World War I, of course, that was the beginning of the collapse. That was in the process of the UK collapsing and losing their empire. So, yeah, similarly, we're there, and it's the collapse of the U.S. empire, and America lacks the imagination to stop it from happening. So this is all the kabuki theater you're seeing going on is one thing. But on the other side of the aisle and the equation is whether or not China actually wants to step up and be a superpower. Now, this is one of the things we were going to talk to our guest Daniel Collins about. He's written an article about the redback and how China is actually more and more trade is happening in China, in Asia, in the yuan. So there are all sorts of currency swaps happening. So China is actually expanding the pool of central bank reserves of the yuan.
That's right. The Chinese are doing bilateral currency swaps with Russia, Iran, other countries. So they've been moving out of the U.S. dollar as world reserve currency status for a while. It's like the old joke about the husband knowing, the last one to know that his wife's been cheating on him. The American people are the last ones in the world to know that the rest of the world has been cheating on the U.S. dollar. They've abandoned the U.S. dollar years ago. It only now is it becoming an issue in the U.S., but it's been an issue around the world ever since China became part of the World Trade Organization, and you had this massive transfer of labor from the U.S. to China, taking advantage of the so-called wage arbitrage, thanks to Bill Clinton, which gutted manufacturing in America. And when they talk about this debt ceiling and the need to stimulate and the need to print more money as reviving the U.S. economy, that would imply that there's some manufacturing base that is there to be revived. But there is no manufacturing base. There's only weapons of mass financial destruction created by banks on Wall Street, and they keep going no matter what the economic conditions are, because it's an economy bound not by the discipline of gold or the rule of law, but by the willy-nilly needs of a bunch of corrupt hedge fund managers who live not far from here in the Hamptons, out on Long Island. They're sitting by their oceanfront property, concocting new ways to destroy countries, whether it's Greece or Dublin or America itself. It's the noose that was used to hang these other countries is now being used to hang the American economy, and the American people are the last to know. The joke is on them.
Speaking of this relationship with China, many of our goods in America are made over there, and therefore the actual American workers don't make much money because they have no jobs. And I wanted to point out an interesting headline in the last few days here in America. Apple now holds more cash than U.S. government. So Apple is now more cash rich than the United States government, figures from the U.S. Treasury Department show. The figures released by the U.S. Treasury Department show the country of the United States currently has a total operating cash balance of $73.7 billion. This compares with Apple's $76.4 billion of cash reserves, which it has built up during a phenomenal half-decade of strong sales. Of course, most of their goods are, well, they're designed and innovated in the United States, but they're all manufactured in China.
Yes, this brings up a number of interesting points, Stacy. First of all, 50% of all of Apple's manufacturing capacity could be in the United States. So instead of having 70 or 80 billion in cash, they might only have 10 or 20 billion in cash. By law, under the SEC, a company's not even allowed to have that much cash without paying a dividend. So they're actually breaking the law on that front. Second of all, this is actual cash on Apple's balance sheet. It's not the money, so-called, that's on the American government's balance sheet, which is actually not hard, cold cash. It's a low-grade debt, which is still debt-based, which is not actual cash. The funny thing is that if Apple were to transform itself to a bank like JP Morgan, they could leverage that $80 billion 10 times over quite easily and be an $800 billion balance sheet. It would be almost $1 trillion balance sheet on top of a company that's generating many hundreds of billions of dollars in sales. But they keep that cash on their balance sheet. Not sure exactly what Steve Jobs' strategy is there, other than to weather some downturn. But the hard, cold, bottom line fact is that if he brought those jobs back to America, he'd have less cash, he'd have more jobs in America, and presumably more people in America able to buy Apple products. You know, most of Apple's sales are now outside of America because people in America can't afford to buy Apple products because Steve Jobs moved all the jobs overseas.
Speaking of Apple having more money than the U.S. government on their books, I think a good idea for America, how they could get out of their debt situation and keep their liquidity flowing to keep the government operating, has emerged from Spain. Spanish bank fields Ronaldo as collateral. So Cristiano Ronaldo, the most expensive footballer in history, has joined the European Central Bank on a free transfer. Sources say the authorities want this help on the sovereign debt crisis by kicking the can further down the road. So he's joking, of course, but actually, Ronaldo could feasibly become the ECB property after he was pledged as collateral for emergency liquidity support by Spain's struggling savings bank, Bankia. Because in 2009, one of the Spanish banks that has since become Bankia lent Real Madrid 76.5 million euros to pay the transfer fees for Ronaldo. Now, because of the liquidity crisis, it has emerged that Bankia has put up the loan as collateral with the ECB in return for vital funding.
Well, these football players have become the new godheads in an economy that worships the collateralization of human flesh in much the same way as we saw 150 years ago in the slave trade. You know, the collateral of slaves drove the triangular trade 150 years ago between the sugar-producing states, the plantations in America, and other points on the map of the globe during the British Empire, as you mentioned previously. And slavery is coming back as a viable business model. What do you think is going to happen to these people in America when they don't have any jobs? They're going to be picking cotton in a new slave market, white cotton-picking slaves down there in Tennessee, in the south of America.
Ronaldo is rated AAA by Moody's. Moody's at the moment is seeking to downgrade America. We're talking about big time, like, forget about the slaves, Max. They don't matter. I'm talking about the big time game here. And so Moody's has rated Ronaldo AAA, which judged the £80 million Real Madrid paid Manchester United for Ronaldo as safe as U.S. government debt. So right now, Ronaldo is the loan on him is as safe as the U.S. government debt, which it could actually be safer very soon.
Yeah, well, it says something about how the economy has now gotten to the point where rating agencies are passing judgments on soccer players, or football players, as we say in Europe, but they're unable to give a structural critique in any meaningful way for an entire country like Spain without actually glomming onto a degrading situation, piling on, and actually making situations much worse. Let me ask you this, by giving Ronaldo a AAA rating and by offering him as collateral to buttress the Spanish economy, is this in fact a net positive for bond markets around the world, or is it just basically the rating agencies laughing at the banks and the people once again and giddy with their imperial power?
Here is the consolidation of wealth and power in the hands of a few. We're emerging into global oligarchy and a global elite. Apple has more money than the U.S. government. Ronaldo could soon have a higher credit rating than the U.S. government. This is what we have when we have concentration of wealth and power. These people are mightier than any government on earth.
Wow, I'd like to, I got to start working on my football game. Obviously. I mean, I used to play ice hockey. I used to come to the Rangers game right here at the Madison Square Garden back in the 70s. I saw the Boston Bruins won the Stanley Cup in the 70s. I was right there in the Garden. Now, where's Bobby Orr? If Ronaldo's worth a AAA credit, Bobby Orr must be worth his weight in platinum, gold-encrusted, precious beyond belief.
Let's end on one positive note, because if the U.S. is downgraded and they have to pay more interest, there is, for the savers, for the retirees, they will be earning more on their treasury bills than they currently are, because right now, the retirees in America, and we've spoken to some while we've been here, have been decimated. Their incomes have collapsed by almost 100%.
That's right. The grandmothers and grandfathers in America are rooting for a collapse because they want the interest rates to go back to 5 and 6% before this jihadi bankers took over, so they can once again have some kind of standard of living. That's absolutely right. The grandmas are out there rooting for a collapse in the U.S. government market. Stacy Herbert, I think we've run out of time. So thanks for being on this extended version.
Thank you, Max. I was a good stand-in for a Chinese economist.
Excellent. And that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser. I want to thank Stacy Herbert. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.